Beruchim haboim. Welcome everyone. We're about to begin Be'ezras Hashem together on Daf Memtes Amud Beis, starting with Memtes Amud Aleph, 5 lines from the bottom. After the Gemara continues to discuss Eruv Chatzeros, now the Gemara wants to understand what is the Lamdus. How does Eruv Chatzeros work? Says the Gemara, Amar Shmuel, Eruv Mishum Kinyan. The way an Eruv works is because a Kinyan, an acquisition, that all of the batim in the Chatzer get to make together and make a kinyan in one of the batim, whereby they all acquire part of the residence of that one house. If you'll say, then why don't you then acquire the acquisition with kesef, with ma? Why are we doing it with bread? Because money is not necessarily found and common on Erev Shabbos. What is common is going to be a loaf of bread. So therefore, a person is going to acquire the part of the bayis. Ayidei, he is putting the bread into the house. Heicha de eruv mihu lekani. Ask the Gemara, but nonetheless, where that he does make a kinyan with kesef, it should work to make the acquisition. Answers the Gemara, no. If we allowed a person to use kesef, then people might think the ikr way of acquiring eruv is through kesef. And sometimes maybe money will not be found, and thereby they'll come to then make they won't come to make the eruv with pas, whereby they'll think that you cannot make an eruv. The whole institution of eruv would then be destroyed. So therefore they said you could no longer make the acquisition with money. It must be made with pas, which is common on Erev Shabbos. Rabba Omar, Rabba says, no, it's a different lamdus. Eruv mishum dira. When each person in the Chatzer places a loaf of bread in the house, then he is now making a certain type of residency in the house. Not because he's acquiring a chelik of the house. No, there's no acquisition. But because the ikr residency of a person is bread, is food, therefore, when he puts bread, he now is part of the residency of that bayis. So every person in the Chatzer who places their loaf of bread in that bayis now has a certain type of residency in the house. My Beinai, what is the difference between these two opinions? Shmuel's opinion that says kinyan, and Rab's opinion that says residency. Ika Beinayu kli. The difference would be a kli. According to the opinion says it's a kinyan, that which Shmuel said a kinyan. Then you can make a kinyan with any kli, which is called a kinyan sudar. And therefore, according to Shmuel, it would be valid using a kli, but according to Rabbah, it would be invalid. Another difference would be upachos mishava pruta, less than a shava pruta. According to Shmuel, it says you need to make a kinyan. Well, less than a shava pruta is less than the minimum coin, which has no value. Therefore, you cannot make a kinyan with something that's less than a shava pruta. And therefore, even when it comes to bread that would be less than a shava pruta, it would be invalid. Whereas according to Rabbah, you could, yes, make the residency with your bread, even though it's less than a shava pruta. On top of Memtes Amud Beis, v'katan, a third difference between the two opinions is a katan. According to Shmuel, who says you're making an acquisition, you can't use a katan to help you make an acquisition. He's not a bar kinyan. Whereas according to Rabbah, since the whole inyan is to make a residency, he can go ahead and collect the bread, and therefore be valid. Says Gemara Vayter Amalei Abai LeRabbah. Rabbi now turns to Rabbah, who said that the way that you're making the Erev Chatzeros is through using a residency. Ledidoch kasha. To you, it's a question. Ulishmuel kasha. And according to Shmuel, it says it's to do a kinyan is also difficult. Hotanyot, because it states in the Braiso, Chamisha shegavu es Eruvin. When there are 5 people in one Chatzer that are collecting the bread to make an Eruv, when they will then place their bread into another chatzir to then make an eruv between the two chatzeros. In other words, not only do they want to make an eruv with their own chatzir, but now they want to enjoin a second chatzir. So it says over here, they can bring all of their bread to the other chatzir, and that will then make an eruv, not acquire, but make an eruv rather, a combination in enjoining with the other chatzir. Echad moilich lekulan. Not only is it necessary to be done through all of the people's bread being brought to another chatzir, but another valid way of enjoining the other chatzir is with one person taking his bread and putting into the other chatzir. So says now Abaye, hu nihu de kakani v'suloi. He is making the acquisition of the other chatzir, the eruv. He's being koine, but they are not. Nobody else is being koine. So that would be a kasha on Shmuel. Hu nihu de kadairi. Vesuloi, he is making a residency, and they are not. Nobody else is, and therefore that's going to be a kasha on Rabbah. Omar le, Rabbah responds to Shmuel, lo li didi kasha v'lo li Shmuel kasha. It's not a kasha on me, this brisa, and it's not going to be a kasha on Shmuel. Shlichus dekulu ka'avid, because he's going to be a shliach for all of the other people. So when he takes his loaf of bread and he puts it into the other chatzir, then they all are going to be either acquiring or they're all going to then making a residency. Either way, he's a shliach on their behalf. Omar Rabbi Omar Rav Chama Bar Guya Marav. Halacha ki Rabbi Shimon. We saw that there's a machlokes between Rabbi Shimon and the Chachamim. When you have three chatzeros that are next to each other, each one opens up to the other, and each one has also an entrance of Rishus HaRabim. The Shmuel said that when the eruv is made between the middle chatzar and the outer chatzeros, so the lashon of the Mishnah was he muteres imohen vehem muteres imo, whereas the shtayim chitzonos asur zu zu. Whereas the Chachamim argue on Rabbi Shimon. The Chachamim say that all three chatzeros are going to be prohibited, one to then go to the other one with an object. In other words, not only the two outer chatzeros, but even the middle to the outer, or the outer to the middle. Now we had a machlokes as to how do we understand Rabbi Shimon. Does Rabbi Shimon mean to say that the object can be brought from the outer chatzeros to the middle chatzer, and vice versa, or only from the outer chatzeros to the middle chatzer, but not from the middle to the outer? Rav was the opinion that you can bring both from the outer chatzeros to the inner chatzer, as well as from the inner chatzer to either outer chatzer. And since Rav is the one who's saying halakha Rabbi Shimon, then we must conclude that that is the way that the halakha is follows, that you can go in both directions. The Gemara now brings the next Mishnah, Mishe ba b'derech v'chosh chaloi. A person who is traveling towards his residency, to his house, and he is too far from his house before the onset of Shabbos. He's 4,000 amos away from his house. Says the Mishnah, V'haya makir ilan oigeder. He knows that there's an ilan, a tree, or there's a row of stones, a stone wall that is 2,000 amos away, whereby he wants to then make a residency over there, whereby on the onset of Shabbos, now when Shabbos comes in, he'll be able to then go from that place to his house. Ve'omar shvisosi tachdov, and he says, my shvisa should be underneath either the tree or underneath this wall. Says the Mishnah, loy omar klum. He doesn't say anything. In other words, it's not valid. Why? Because since the wall and the Elon are beyond Daled Amos, they're very wide, they're more than Daled al Daled, therefore, it wasn't specific as to where he was going to be kind of his shvisa, so it's invalid. However, shvisasi bi'ikaroi, if he says, I want my shvisa to be by the trunk of the tree, then it's going to be valid. Says the Mishnah, Mahalach mimokom raglov ve'ad ikaro alpayim amma. He can go ahead and then walk 2,000 amos to where that tree trunk is situated. Umikara ve'ad beisa alpayim amma. And he can then go from 2,000 amos, from that tree trunk, to 2,000 amos to where his house is, because he then was koine shvisa where the tree is. Nimso mahalech meshach hashecha arbot alafim amo. It comes out that at the time of the entrance of Shabbos, he went 4,000 amos, 2,000 amos he extended to where his makam shvisa will be by the trunk, and that's where then he can then go 2,000 amos in all directions, including the further direction of 2,000 amos to his house. The Mishnah goes on to say, Im eino makir or she'eino baki behalacha. If he does not know either where there's a tree or where there is a wall, or he's not a baki in halacha knowing that you can be koine shvisa, then, and he says, O ma shvisasi b'makoimi, and he says, I want my shvisa to be where I am, then zachaloi mekoimai alpayim am lekol. Then he is acquiring shvisa in that place where he is. And he will then have 2,000 amos in all directions. Now this comes in contrast to the very first case that we mentioned. When he said that I want to be a koine shvisa underneath, let's say, the tree, and we said his words are not going to be valid because he didn't specify where underneath the tree, then not only is he not koine shvisa underneath the tree, but he doesn't even have 2,000 amos from where he is. He wasn't koine shvisa in his makom. He only has dalet amos. Over here we're saying that if he says he's koine shvisa in his makom, then he will have 2,000 amos in all directions. Now how do we measure the 2,000 amos is a machlekes. Says the Mishnah, Agulois divrei Rabbi Chanina ben Antignois. Rabbi Chanina ben Antignois says he has a radius of 2,000 amos. In all directions, he has a radius of 2,000 amos. V'chachamim oimrim mirubois kitavlo mirubois kidei sheniska lizavios. Chachamim argue and say no. He has 2,000 amos in all directions, and then you can make a square. In other words, he's marviach that if you go diagonal, you would even have more than 2,000 amos because you would have an entire square around that radius. Says the Mishnah Vaiter, V'zu hi she'amru he'oni me'arev beraglov. That which we said a person can make a shvisa with his raglov, meaning without putting pas, but just by then making with his regel, by his presence. Omar Rabbi Meir, Anu ein lanu ela ani. This is only talking about an ani, meaning who's an ani? Somebody who does not have pas. Either he's a traveler, because he doesn't have pas, or an ani who doesn't have the wherewithal, he doesn't have additional pas to make a eruv with. That's when we said you can be koine shvisa with your regel. But otherwise, the ikar kinyan is with pas. And therefore you cannot make an eruv with pas if you're not without pas if you're not an ani. Rabbi Yehuda Oimer. Rabbi Yehuda argues, Echad ani ve'echad ashir. Lo amru bepas ela lahokil ala ashir shelo yetze ve'eruv beraglov. In other words, Rabbi Yehuda says the ikar eruv is beraglov, and therefore both the ani and the ashir can make an eruv beraglov. Why did they say that you should make an eruv bepas? Because let's say a person, an usher, let's say, is in his place, and he doesn't want to go all the way to then the place where he wants to be koine shvisa. He wants to send a shliach in his place, so he can remain where he is and send somebody else. Then he will then send the shliach using pas to being koine the shvisa. But in regards to being koine shvisa beraglov, bein ani, bein ashir.